Good morning, people. It is Friday, December 15th. Hope you're all doing well. Morning. We've seen that this market is very resilient to the upside, and what we're going to be breaking down today is obviously a trade plan and ideas based on the S&P 500 futures. But first and foremost, we're going to break down some of the news as we enter the week. Morning, Laurent. I hope you're doing well. Or we should look at the news before we enter the weekend. Today is Friday, December 15th. This is the fourth Friday of the year that we have the Quadwitch. So the Quadwitch means that options, futures on equities and stocks are going to expire, right? This quarterly expiration, which happens 4 times a year, and today is one of those days. Suggesting that we're going to see some chop and slop, some kind of maybe sideways action. It's going to be less of an easy read, in my opinion, compared to just general market movement. And pre-market, we had some news out of some Fed officials, like Fed Williams, who was not too keen on cutting rates as the economy continues to progress in such a light. Because you have unemployment figures that are very low. You have the market that's extremely high right now, just pumping up very, very aggressively. And where can this take us in the medium to short term and the long term? A lot of people are expecting that first rate cut to come in March 2024, but I think a lot of people are going to be surprised considering there's no necessary reason to do so, keeping the rates higher for longer, which is something that we talked about yesterday. So let's break down what some of this quad witching means. We'll break down some of the other news events that came out here. And the quad witching, generally speaking, when you have options and futures expiring on equities and indices, what you're going to see is a very sideways or theoretically sideways and choppy price action throughout the day if there's no news that induces this. There's going to be a lot of changing in positions, market maker changing in positions as well, trying to subdue things and keep it on a flat line. And I'm expecting to see such sideways rotation today as we are building out a new distribution block into these highs on the S&P. And generally speaking, right, if we can't get continuous selling that closes below key levels, you're going to get this consolidation that actually breaks to the upside. So we'll talk a bit more about that today, but first and foremost, let's talk about China and China's economy that came into the news over the last day or so, right? As we've seen that the Chinese economy actually continues to falter, and Beijing is expected to run up a budget deficit of 3% of its gross domestic product next year, lower than the revised 3.8% target for 2023, with the aim of maintaining fiscal discipline, and its economy growth targets around 5% in 2024. The targets were drafted by President Xi Jinping and other officials during the Central Economic Work Conference and will be announced publicly during China's annual parliament meeting in March. So, other fiscal support expenditures may be covered by off-budget sovereign debt, including the potential special sovereign bond issuance amounting to 1 trillion yuan, which is about 140 billion US dollars. So, special bonds, which are not included in China's annual budget, are used to raise funds for projects or policy goals when needed. And the bond quota for local governments could be around 4 trillion yuan, which is about $562 billion US next year, compared to its 3.8 trillion yuan, this year's 3.8 trillion yuan. So the leaders agreed to implement a proactive fiscal policy to step up efforts to maintain sufficient liquidity in line with the economic growth targets. And they agreed the financial institutions should be guided to scale up support for scientific and technological innovation. And in addition, overall financial costs must steadily drop while RMB exchange rate is maintained at a reasonable level. So if we look at this, right, we recently saw out of China's political sphere, they said that fiscal policy must be moderately strengthened in the wake of post-pandemic economic slowdown, and the country's fiscal position has been under threat, with Moody's downgrading its government credit ratings, as its government will likely have to bail out financial stressed local governments and state-owned enterprises, as well as tame the property crisis, as we've seen many blowouts in large Chinese firms even over the past year. So the FTSE Russell sees opportunity in investing in China, and it's undergoing a transformational period to maintain sustainable growth after years of rapid expansion. So we've seen that The Chinese market and Asian markets have been dropping pretty aggressively on the back of a pretty strong US market, which can fizzle into the grand scheme of things as we enter into the new year. So, over the last few days, what we've had is a lot of central bank talking. We've seen the Federal Reserve out of the US, right, constantly dropping in. And now, right, we're looking at the ECB as well. So while traders around the world, they looked at the Fed's dovish pivot, they've seen this market, the S&P 500, nearly tap an all-time high. Everyone's applauding, everyone's loving it. Bull market back, buy all dips, right? Because they're betting on earlier cuts than expected. This is what changed that original May first expected cut to now March. So we'll see how that does shape up. And in my opinion, I think the Fed cuts prematurely, right? I think that they're getting a very eager to cut, and that happens on a premature basis, which would cause a pretty strong downshift in the overall market. Now, Fed's Williams recently came on this morning and talked about just that he said the pivot is happening too soon and they're not expecting necessarily to cut as soon as people would expect. So the European Central Bank, right, and the IMF, the International Monetary Fund's chief, have cautioned against jumping the gun in the battle against inflation. So if everything is kind of going the way as it should realistically, and we're getting towards those inflation targets, rates are up, markets are going up, economic strength is coming back, unemployment is very, very low, what is the real point in cutting rates unless there's other underlying reasoning to do so? So sometimes countries prematurely declare victory and then inflation gets more entrenched and the fight becomes much, much harder, warned IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva, so she's Bulgarian, that's interesting. A day after the Fed left its key policy rate unchanged, the European Central Bank and Bank of England did the same, as well as Canada, right, a week or two before. Although both central banks still pushed back against the rate cut talk. But many believe that the Fed has now set the tone, making it harder for other major central banks to remain hawkish, right? As the Fed generally does. So we'll see when the real tide comes, but expecting continued upside momentum in the markets into the end of Q1, right? So there's no real reason right now to actually cut rates. So if you look at the economic calendar today, we have PMI composite flash numbers that come out at 9:45, and then Baker Hughes rig count for oil. Otherwise, we don't really have much else. We just have the overall Quadwitch that is shaping up today. Something to take note of, naturally. And you want to enter these markets, you want to be a little slower, you want to trade less size, you want to make sure the confirmation is there, you want to over qualify trades if anything, and reduce the size significantly. Fridays aren't supposed to be days to make or break your week, and especially on a quad witching Friday. Now, what's going on here on this market, this S&P 500? What we can see is multiple days creating a balance. When multiple days create a balance and we can't close lower, you can see this massive tail that shaped up yesterday, only to get rebid back into the distribution, suggests that these sellers are weak, right? Sellers are weak. They tried it throughout the day, right? They had a pretty big move. They dropped down to the 50 or so, a bit lower than that. So a 40-point move from the highs on day yesterday, only to get rebid back up. Same thing happening right now. News comes in. They dump this thing back into a key area, into that 70, only for the bid to come in again, right? Trading about like 6-8 points higher right now from that distribution low. So the main distribution low sits around that low 70, high 60, the way that I see it, right? You have another key area that sits at 50, high 40s, which is an area that bought aggressively on the Fed day, right? Massive, multiple thousands of lots came into that area on the bid on the market buy that propped this thing up. The top band into that high 80, low 90 is the top of this distribution. And as long as we remain within, we want to play the extremes of the distribution until we actually get a close/open outside of this distribution to lead us into some kind of extension to the downside or upside. So the way that I see this, I think that this low 70, high 60 holds the bottom band of the distribution today, and we kind of get a chop and slop in the middle of this large block before we run into the weekend. So the sellers, they're running out of time. They have to take heed before this thing taps an all-time high. They have to get a little more aggressive, and I think it's going to be very hard to be a buyer under this mid-60 on the S&P 500 futures unless you're fading very big areas which remain at the 50, like 47.50 down into that 37.38, right? Very important level. Then you're coming back into lower band distributions if you start breaking further and further to the downside. So I'm leaning on a balance today. Sideways kind of crappy action is what I'm going to be calling it for the day. You can see right now pre-market the buy side's coming in against a lot of that news that shaped up this downside. So I'll leave you with that, and I hope everyone has an amazing weekend. Enjoy, take care, and we'll be back again to do this on Monday. I am flying back to North America on Tuesday for the holidays, so we're going to be back on Eastern time. Annoying. Anyways, hope everyone has an amazing weekend, has a good Friday, and take care and enjoy everyone. We'll chat